Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. We interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests about innovation, leadership, and change in the world of business. Whether you're an executive or an entrepreneur, our objective is to help you and your organisation create an entrepreneurial culture, become more innovative, and better able to respond to change. Each week, we'll deconstruct world-class performance from the arenas of business, academia, science, and sports. Each week, you can expect key insights, fresh perspectives, and proven tools you can use straight away to make you more successful professionally and personally. With your hosts, Mark Bidwell and Roddy Miller.
Hello, I'm Roddy Miller, your co-host on the Innovation Ecosystem podcasts. I hope you enjoyed last week's show, when Mark interviewed Whitney Johnson about personal disruption, the power of constraints, and a number of other topics that you can apply straight away. This week, I'm talking with Shane O'Mara. Shane is Professor of Experimental Brain Research and Director of the Neuroscience Institute at Trinity College Dublin, Ireland's oldest and most prestigious university. He's the author of several books. His most recent, published by Harvard Business Press, is Why Torture Doesn't Work, and is a searing critique of torture as an effective method of obtaining reliable information. Shane has also worked with large corporations in Europe and North America, advising on how cognitive neuroscience can impact on performance. In this show, you'll hear how important it is for you, as leaders and managers, to get up to date on how the brain works and its impact on teams and relationships, and Shane's caution on how much executives can use those insights. Shane also reflects on how stress impacts performance in organizations and the damage that overly competitive working environments can cause for individuals and long-term business sustainability. This is a real issue, both for entrepreneurs and leaders building long-term businesses. I was fascinated by his explanation of how the brain works hard even when we don't think we're using it, that this is the time where connections are made, ideas ferment, and sense-making starts. This is the crux of neuroscience discoveries for leaders, I think, and undermines so much of the overwork, crazy hours culture we so often see in organizations these days. A future guest, David Allen, explains how to take advantage of this and enjoy stress-free productivity. Also listen out for the connected message Shane shares on the power and importance of sleep and how we all underplay its benefits to not just our health, but also our performance. It's a fascinating area, and I hope you find it as revelatory as I do. This has relevance for all of us. I'm delighted to have Shane O'Mara, Professor of Experimental Brain Research, with us here today. Hello to you, Shane.
Hi indeed, Roddy. How are you? I'm delighted to be here.
Shane, we've spoken a few times in the past. You've written for my magazine, Developing Leaders. Neuroscience is an area that I'm truly fascinated in, and I'm delighted to be speaking with you this morning. Our understanding of how the brain works has advanced hugely since the turn of the century. This is largely due, I think, to better technology, particularly functional MRI scanning, allowing scientists like you to see how the brain operates in real time. And in tandem with that, there's been a growth of cognitive neuroscience, the interpretation of how our behaviors based on that new understanding of brain mechanics, if I can put it like that. This has led to much greater insight in how we operate and function in groups, and specifically at work in organizations. What I was wanting to know is how necessary or beneficial do you think it is for leaders, managers, and team workers to understand the basics of the brain? Does it help, or is a little knowledge a dangerous thing?
So that's a very difficult question, actually. To some extent, I think it depends on the manager themselves and the extent to which they're willing to acknowledge the limits to their own knowledge and to be able to work within those kind of boundaries. So you get, just like you've had over the past 100 years, a lot of naive neuroscience out there. You get people going on about oxytocin, for example, being the love molecule, and turns out that the story is much more complicated than that. And I think what people need to understand is a few simple principles, rather than pretending that they need to know a lot of great detail about, for example, how particular molecules act within the brain.
There's a lot of all the connections that that we read about between various parts of the brain. And it seems also that what we're reading about has changed significantly in the last 10, 15 years in any case. There was a lot of focus at one stage around the importance of the amygdala making these sort of snap emotional judgments. Is there a benefit for workers to understand some of the philosophy behind that, do you think? Or is it too dangerous to oversimplify?
I think the problem here is a similar problem that you get in many domains. And it's this, that neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, social neuroscience can provide you with general case principles that are useful as kind of frameworks to think about. But the particular issue you have is dealing with individuals and dealing with individuals in a social context. So what you have to be very, very careful about is adopting an all-embracing explanatory framework from neuroscience, from social neuroscience, from cognitive neuroscience, whatever it happens to be, that forgets about the simple fact that we are dealing with individuals, and that what might hold true for a population at a high level may not be true of an individual in particular. Medicine has had this problem, for example, for generations. We know that diagnostics in medicine are done at a population level. New treatments, for example, for cancer, are done at a population level. You're looking at thousands of patients. But predicting individual response is actually something that continues to be very, very difficult. So what I would say is people should be cognizant of the discoveries that are being made, but not be over rigid in their interpretation or application of those discoveries where any individual is concerned.
Okay, now that makes lots of sense, and I think it's probably important advice that we shouldn't be trying to make our own diagnoses of individuals, particularly if we don't really know the full stories and background. Taking this forward, your recent book, Why Torture Doesn't Work, which you published at the end of last year, deals in great detail with the science of interrogation, how it debilitates mental capacity, particularly memory and mood. And in the case of torture, compromises the capacity to provide reliable information. And torture is obviously a very extreme application of stress. But we also know that working in organizations, stress is ever present in workplaces. Is it possible to extrapolate that sort of extreme understanding of stress and how it affects the brain into more long-term stress situations as people experience at work?
I actually think yes is the answer, and I can think of many examples, but let's define our terms first. Stress isn't necessarily bad for you. It isn't necessarily good for you. And when we talk about stress from a neuroscientific perspective, what we're talking about is the extent to which you as an individual perceive what's happening to you as being beyond your control, where the outcomes are likely in some way to be extremely unpleasant, and you're not able to do anything to mitigate what's going on. And there are lots of examples of this in the workplace. We know workplace bullying, for example, is terribly common and acts as a terrible stressor. We know that the demands of certain modern workplaces are terribly demanding, and again act as a terrible stressor. Like, for example, Business Insider over the weekend has an article on the numbers of Japanese who are dying as a result of overwork because they're putting in 18-hour days, 7 days a week, in a kind of a case of unremitting and unrelenting toil. And our bodies and our brains are not built to work like this. We need time on, but we need time off, and to function optimally. What we need is some sense of control, some sense of autonomy, and some sense that we're being stretched by the challenges that are being posed to us, but that the stressors that are in the environment are ones that ultimately we can exert some control over.
And we see that coming through presumably you reference it in the torture book around people's inability to recall effectively and
compromises the capacity to provide reliable information. Presumably, stress in the workplace also compromises your capacity to perform at a high degree.
Yeah, we know this with a high degree of certainty that when people are put under extreme stress, and that stress is unrelenting, and they don't have the capacity either in the workplace or when they step away from the workplace to kind of get a distance from it, that their ability to problem solve, their ability to be creative, their ability to go in refreshed every day, all of those kinds of things are terribly compromised. And you can demonstrate this in all sorts of work environments, from extreme work environments that are experienced, for example, by combat soldiers, but to simpler work environments, for example, transport workers who have to regularly change shifts or who have to work split shifts. Though, you know, all those kinds of things are people who are working as traders where they have to make flash decisions one after the other, and the consequences of those decisions can be very, very costly. And indeed, we have seen that with the terrible financial collapse that happened 7 or 8 years ago, where lots and lots of bad decisions were made under great duress, often in people who were terribly sleep deprived and who, if they'd had a little bit of distance and a slightly different perspective offered by that distance, might have come to a better solution.
And that, to a large part, is cultural as well, though, presumably, isn't it? That organizations build that level of pressure on people to perform. And in fact, it cuts in the other direction for them, that in fact it undermines the performance rather than enhances it. It's a long-term struggle, presumably, to shift that around.
Yeah, so I think this is actually one of these issues that it's very hard to get an empirical sense of, because you can't do randomized controlled trials or you can't do experiments. But it is clearly the case that cultures vary within and between organizations, and that there's a certain tone set by management in terms of how it is that an organization should prosper. And some places are terribly high pressure. They have stack ranking procedures where it ends up that you're ranked on a curve against not how you're doing against the competition, but how you're doing against somebody down the corridor, and people get dismissed. And people clearly, under those circumstances, are going to give as much loyalty to the organization as the loyalty gives to them, which is to say not very much. So, you know, I think this issue of culture and how culture is established, maintained, and how it impacts on individual performance is something that managers really need to think very, very carefully about. You know, while we can be amused at a distance by a book title like Only the Paranoid Survive, is that really the way that we want our organizations to work? You might end up getting, you know, curious and interesting selection effects where people will work who like that kind of environment will work in that environment, but other people who can't or who don't like it will move away from it. And you end up with a kind of a loss of diversity in terms of the kinds of information that a company has access to, and in terms of the solutions that it can generate as a result of those kind of cultures. And we've heard, for example, that Microsoft had all sorts of interesting devices back in the late 90s, early 2000s, which subsequently other competitors brought to the market, but were seen as too dangerous because of the processes that they had in place in terms of staff management.
Taking that forward with innovation in mind, is there a typical set of processes that occur in the brain that enable ideas and sense-making to occur, or does it happen in a huge range and variety of ways? And I suppose my point in asking that is, if there is a reasonably standardized way of ideas being created, can you therefore create environments where that is going to happen more effectively?
So that's actually a great question, and we can answer it on kind of multiple levels. So one of the great discoveries of the last 10 or 12 years in neuroscience has been this idea that the brain is comprised of a series of interacting networks. And while we're talking, a couple of those networks are engaged. So what's called the executive network. So that's my frontally one sitting at the frontal lobes. that allows me to pay attention to you, process the information that you're providing me, and allows me to generate a response to you. What was not appreciated was that there's a countervailing network to that. It's sometimes called the default mode network or the resting state network. And this is a network that's engaged when you're doing nothing. If I ask you to close your eyes, just not think of anything in particular, what we see is the brain is even more active in that daydreaming state than it is when you're paying attention. Really, really remarkable finding. And a lot of neuroscientists now take the view that the well springs of creative problem solving arise from the interaction between this kind of resting state network and our executive network. And we know this in popular parlance. We say to each other, I have a great idea. An idea has just come to mind. I've just thought of something. And what you're actually saying is an idea has forced itself into consciousness and you're going to articulate it. But where did that idea come from? It came from this network. The job of this network is to probe your long-term memory, to sort of search out for associations that might be useful in terms of solving the problem that it is that you're trying to do. And a useful piece of advice, especially when you're trying to solve a difficult problem, if you don't have to solve it today, don't solve it today. Think about it. Feed these non-conscious parts of your brain with information. Go away and sleep on it. And the phrase to sleep on it actually is meaningful. We know that when we give people difficult problems to solve, which don't have good solution sets, that the best solution set, usually, if you're buying a car, you're thinking about a house, some sort of difficult problem at work, is actually to give you lots of information about what it is that you have to do, and then tell you go away and have a sleep and come back and talk and solve the problem the next day. And the solution will present itself. And for those kinds of difficult, ill-defined problems, this part of the mind, this part of the brain, the default mode, is there working away happily in the background. So let it do its job. Don't feel that you have to solve the problem straight away if you don't have to.
That's both hugely comforting, I think, and hugely enlightening, because I think there's such a pressure on us to make instant decisions all the time. I suspect intuitively we do know that slept-on decisions or reflected upon decisions are better ones. You mentioned that allows you to access the long-term memory. Is that where these sort of more complex problem-solving issues occur? Or
well, what you're doing in effect is you're giving your brain the time to probe what are called its semantic networks. So the parts of the brain that encode for the experiences that you've had, and you're giving the default mode network the chance to probe around these different parts of your brain in order to provide you with other potential solutions. And I think, you see, we have a problem with how we work generally, and with how we conceive of ourselves. Our mental life is really crowded all the time. So if I say to you, don't think of a red elephant, what have you done?
We know what picture was in my mind just then.
We know exactly. The answer comes to you quickly, swiftly. If I say to you, how many children do you have? Boom, you've got the answer straight away. What color is your car? Boom, you've got the answer straight away. And these are very straightforward, very quick things. They're very simple problems to solve. It's only one node down the network. But if you have a much more difficult problem to solve, for example, how is it that I'm going to reorganize the sales force in the southwest of England? They're underperforming relative to the sales force in the southeast. You can think of answers straight away, but are they the right answers? Mm-hmm. It's a fuzzy problem. It's not a problem for which your instant gut response is actually the right one necessarily. And what you need to do is get lots of information in, talk to people, talk to diverse people, talk to people who are different to you, who have access to information that you don't have, and think about it over a period of a couple of days. And solutions, the solutions that you will come to with that kind of process would be different to the solution that instantaneous response that you have will be.
I mean, I'm intrigued there that you suggest that we should think about it, but how much of that is conscious thought and how much is somehow occurring without us pushing it, forcing it through?
An awful lot of it is non-conscious thought, in truth, which almost sounds like a contradiction in terms that you can be thinking without thinking, without consciously thinking. But we do this for breathing, we do this for digestion, we do this for walking, we do this for seeing, for hearing. All of these kinds of processes happen in the background without us knowing necessarily that they're actually ongoing. And it's not as if this is something that we're entirely unconscious of. I give you a little quote. I think this is worth thinking about because we get this from poets, artists, writers an awful lot. So Graham Greene, the writer, was working on his book The End of the Affair, and he says something very interesting, that lots in your writing depends on the superficiality of your days. You can be preoccupied with your shopping, your tax returns, whatever it happens to be. And then he says, remarkably, but the stream of the unconscious continues to flow undisturbed, solving problems, planning ahead. One sits down sterile and dispirited at the desk, and suddenly the words come as though from the air. The work has been done while one slept or shopped or talked with friends.
I think that's fantastic. It's really powerful, isn't it? The work has been done whilst you're interacting with other people.
Yeah, and that's the key point. What you're doing is feeding this non-conscious thought process with lots of information, and you're just leaving it to do its own thing. Because, can you think of a more undefined and fuzzy problem than writing a novel? Mm-hmm. Possibly writing a poem. Or trying to solve a very, very difficult scientific problem. We talked about Darwin earlier on. And to give you a very fine example from Darwin, before he published the theory of evolution by natural selection, which is the piece that people always forget, it's not the theory of evolution, it was by natural selection, he delayed and prevaricated for years. Why did he do this? He did this because, for lots of reasons, but one was to test whether or not he was right or not. And he maintained an enormous correspondence with people all around the world who provided him information. And if you look at his letters, he asks for very, very specific pieces of information about what worms were feeding on, what the environment these worms were in, what the adaptations of the birds to the burrows that the worms were making were. All of these kinds of very, very detailed kinds of questions, so that he could test to the limit the kinds of ideas that he eventually published in really his world-changing book in 1859, I believe it was. And he had been thinking about this for 15, maybe 20 years prior to publication. And what more ill-defined problem set could you work on than how it is that life ends up so varied, yet so connected? And he provided us with a very elegant and not obvious theory for how this might happen. Lots of others had done this before him. Lamarck, for example, his own uncle, Erasmus Darwin, lots of others. But Darwin himself, Charles Darwin, was the one who nailed it. But he did it on this basis. You worry away, you think about it, you let it go, process in the background, and eventually, when you've tested yourself to the limit with the information that you can gather, then you've got the right answer.
And that mirrors very much. You wrote a piece for us in Developing Leaders in the last issue, in fact, where you explained how we all make snap decisions, and particularly about people. And you were highlighting what you called that our brains are cognitive misers, making these quick judgments about others. And there was a really interesting part there where you were saying that, in fact, the parts of the brain that we use to judge people is exactly the same as we used to judge commercial brands and associate them with trust and value. But it seems to me from what you're saying that the complex thought and and the way we judge people ought to be a complex decision, needs to be much more reflected upon. Are there things that we could be doing or should be doing to push back against those instant judgments, instant decisions?
Yeah, I think there are lots of things that one could do. So, let's think about the problem first of all. When we meet somebody for the first time, we make a very snap judgment about how that person is disposed towards us.
There's presumably a reason for that. I mean, presumably, evolutionarily, that's a necessary thing for us to do.
Yeah, you need to make that call very, very quickly. You don't have much time. Is that blob over there with the bow and arrow going to shoot the deer, or is he going to shoot me? So he can shoot the deer. You have to make these judgments very, very quickly. You're walking down a dark alley, and is the guy with the bottle who's drinking from that bottle, is he going to have a go at you? Is he not? So these have to be very quick decisions. But the environment we find ourselves in, where we're making, for example, employee selection decisions, aren't like that. What we're doing is making an investment in a person who's likely to be with us for a very, very long period of time, months to years, and that person will cost money. So what we tend to do is choose people who are like us because, we like ourselves, so we're going to like people that are like us. But actually, the decision that we make in those kind of employee selection situations is made on the basis of a very thin slice of behavior. You've got the person's CV, and you've got somebody comes in, has got a nice firm handshake, a nice warm smile, and you're in love with them straight away. And that person is then with you for the next X number of years, whatever that happens to be. So what we need to do is actively de-bias ourselves. I think a great and salient example is to look at how orchestras behave. This is not an example original to me. It's been used by a number of authors, including Iris Bonnet and Malcolm Gladwell. But if you look at the Boston Symphony Orchestra in 1950, it was about 5% female. If you look at the Boston Symphony Orchestra now, it's about 45-50% female. And what happened in that time? Well, what happened was very simple. The Boston Symphony Orchestra, it stopped choosing people on the basis of open auditions, and it went to blind auditions behind a curtain. And you find yourself then not choosing the musician who plays the cello that you like because he looks a bit like you and he sounds nice and he's got a good baritone voice or whatever it happens to be that fools you. You're making the decision coldly on the basis just of the music they're playing and the quality of their musicianship. And that de-biases your decision. And I think that this is what we need to do an awful lot more of in the work environment, that we're swayed by salient but extraneous factors that may be useful, when you're making a snap decision over somebody that you'll never meet again. But when you're making decisions about people that you're going to work with, what you want to do is choose the person who's the best possible person for that job. And we have to de-bias the networks that force us in this direction at the start.
The challenge with that, of course, is that you can probably, in a pretty quantifiable way, objective way, measure their technical competence. But in fact, what you're really saying, though, is it's their ability to work with others that is going to be the critical factor. And that's much more difficult for us to assess.
Well, Google have given us a great example of this. They have done some fantastic work on choosing what it is or how it is that we know that people will work well within Google. And they, famously had these advertisements where you had to solve a complex mathematical problem that chose people on the basis of grade point average, the university that they attended, all of those kinds of things. And it turns out none of those are predictive of on-the-job performance at all. The best predictor of how you're going to perform on the job is past performance at the technical components of the job. So if you want to choose somebody who's a coder, don't ask them what university they went to. Don't ask them what GPA they got. You won't get very far with either Zuckerberg or some of the other tech people by asking them about their GPA because they dropped out.
They all flunked out. Yeah.
Yeah, but get them to do a bit of coding and see what happens. And it turns out those are the kinds of variables that are actually important, rather than I went to such and such an Ivy League university or whatever it happens to be. And forcing ourselves to think in these kinds of terms is difficult, but it actually ultimately is much more rewarding because we end up with better people to work with who are more competent and who will teach us things that we don't know.
Yeah, it's that theory of always wanting to not be the best person in the room. Have someone brighter to lead you on.
Yeah. But that means taking your ego out of things and being humble.
Yeah, which is very hard to do. Exactly. And we all know that the brain is massively complex with billions of connections being made all the time. It's also extraordinarily efficient, though, isn't it? And I was reading somewhere the other day, I think it was after the computer had beaten that grandmaster at the game of Go a couple of weeks ago. And someone was making the point that, in fact, the grandmaster's brain was using a tenth or a hundredth of the electrical energy to keep it going.
Oh, probably even less.
Or even less, is that right?
And here's the challenge that I always, when I see these things, I always think this is hilarious. I'd be worried about computers being better than us at and being able to substitute for us when we can design a computer that can design another computer to beat us. At the moment, the Go machine is very, very good at doing what it's doing because it has the combined input of 200 years of mathematics and computing theory behind it, and then hundreds of brains that actually designed the damn program. And
half a power station to run it.
And half a power station to run it. It may well be the case that we will get to these kinds of autonomous systems that are capable of self-reflection and saying, well, I can't beat that guy at Go, but I can design a computer or another one of me that can.
Yeah.
And that's what we've done. I think we shouldn't care too much about the achievement of the computer, and we should spend a lot of time thinking about the achievement of the individuals who designed and programmed that computer.
I mean, where do you think it's a question you can't really answer, but I'll ask it anyway. How much do we understand about the brain yet? How far down that journey are we? How long do you think it'll be before we get there? I suppose my comparison is we think we understand the heart pretty well in terms of its mechanics and how it works these days. We're clearly only just beginning that journey with the brain.
So where are we? I actually think in many respects we've done a great job, depending on the level of analysis that you want to go to. So, for example, we have a couple of marvelous popular books which summarize much of what we've discovered in terms of our biases where thinking is concerned. And I would pick on Daniel Kahneman's, Thinking Fast and Slow, mm-hmm. as a very, very good example of a compendium of the kinds of problems that we have, or an even better, well, maybe not better, but certainly an equally superb book is Richard Nesbitt's Mindware. And I think books like that have the capacity to materially change how it is that we behave. If you become aware, for example, that in our thinking, we have a real problem with a confirmation bias. So this is our willingness to select information that supports our point of view and ignore information that's contrary to our point of view. If you then build in fail-safe procedures where you ask people to assemble the evidence that's contrary to their point of view, then you will end up as a result with better decision making. And this is one of the reasons I think science has worked so well and has been so successful, is because material, when you publish a paper or whatever, it goes through peer review and people test you in terms of what it is that you're saying. And then it goes through a whole process of replication. You have to stand up in scientific conferences and say what it is that you think you found, and people take great pleasure in trying to find the holes in your argument. And it's a very chastening kind of experience, but it's a good way of getting us toward a position of having slightly more certain knowledge. And I think just in everyday decision making, if we get better at things like understanding what the biases that we have are in terms of our thinking, I think that's fantastic. In terms of something a little bit more relating to brain function, I think the general idea that our brains are plastic and remain plastic throughout life, to my mind, is a really profound and important one, possibly the most important one that we have. While it's difficult for people to maybe take it very seriously, it is the case that the brain is changed by our experiences, it's changed by our attitudes, it's changed by how we talk to ourselves. We really do need to be conscious of the fact that because this happens to be the way we are, it doesn't mean the way that has to be the way we will always be. Just take those two different poles. Those, I think, would be the two things that I would pick on. Okay, excellent.
There are a couple of questions I always like to ask at the end of these conversations, and I think applying it from a brain perspective is going to be really interesting. We always like to ask whether people have particular routines that sets them up for the day, and I wonder if you do, and if so, what that is. But also, I wonder if there's a reflection you might have about how that sort of building a routine can help or indeed can hinder how you operate from a brain perspective.
So that's a hard question. I suppose during school term, my routine is determined by the school run in the morning. But beyond the school run, it really depends on the jobs of the day and the tasks that have to be achieved. So, for example, when I was writing the book that we talked about earlier on, to do that properly, you need 2 to 3 hour blocks where you're left alone and where you resist the temptation of the computer in terms of emails and Twitter and all of those kinds
of things.
Distractions, exactly. So timetabling blocks of time where that people can't find you so that you can actually write or read in order to write is hard. Figuring out those kinds of times is difficult. So I must say, I found when I was writing the book that the easiest time to write was during the summer, when most of the undergrads are not around, so I only have my own research group to work with. And at night, what I would do is a lot of preparatory things during the day, reading this, that, and the other, making notes on this, that, and the other, and then actually getting down to the business of writing in the evening. And actually, I've always found when I'm slightly tired, I think most clearly, or at least I think most creatively.
And does that go back to what we were talking about earlier, that there's less executive function getting in the way at that stage?
That's exactly the point. Your internal sensor isn't working very efficiently when you're tired, which is good. But you have to go back and the next day be brutal with yourself and figure out, was what I was writing absolute garbage or was it okay? But I think, again, the trick there is to forestall judgment. Don't judge yourself on the material until a little bit of time has passed. And that makes life a bit more easy. And I actually find, to be honest, with writing research grants, which is the lifeblood of any research group, I find writing at night easier. But it also means that I don't watch television.
No idea what's going on in Game of Thrones in that case. Or
no, I've heard of it, but I don't know what it's about.
It's filmed just up the road from you. Is that partly because you're a night owl, though, as well? Is there a personal sort of circadian part to that, or not?
Yeah, I suspect there's a bit of me that is a bit of a night owl. That I like reading and thinking at night because it's quiet. There are fewer distractions around. Yeah, I think there's certainly a part of me that might be like that. But I think also, there's a part of me that just enjoys kind of, you're free to follow your own thing that hour. You don't have that internal sensor. I hate rising very early in the morning, I must be honest.
No, I'm entirely with you. It's funny, my co-host, Mark, who does these with me is very much an early morning bird, and I'm very much not.
I think that brings us to something that actually we haven't touched on, and this is something I want to say out loud. We in the developed world don't respect sleep enough. Sleep deprivation. I have a long chapter on sleep deprivation in my book in experimental populations. Sleep deprivation, and to be chronically sleep deprived, is a very, very bad thing for you. We know chronic insomniacs, parts of their brain are shrunken as a result of a lack of sleep. And we know that when you're chronically sleep deprived, you don't think as clearly, your memory doesn't work as well, you don't consolidate the events of the day. So, people who go around boasting that they only need 4 hours of sleep should be despised, should be cast out of normal society, because they try and define what the rest of us are like. But actually, what we need is somewhere for the average person between about 6.5 to maybe 7.5 hours of sleep per day. Whether that's in one cycle or 2 cycles doesn't really matter. But we do need that.
So the siesta is acceptable, is it?
The siesta is totally acceptable. And in fact, if you look back through history to, let's say, medieval times, when most of us would have been farmers, what would have happened in those days was you went to bed when night came, and after 4 or 5 hours, you would get up. You'd go milk the cows, you'd go take the eggs from the chickens, you'd do a number of jobs, and then you go back to bed for 3 hours. This modern pattern of having a single 7-8 hour block of sleep is actually something that's only happened in the last 100 years. It's not the pattern that we would have had.
It comes with factories and electric light, basically.
Exactly. And this is why I think, if people need to nap during the day, they should never feel guilty about this. It's perfectly reasonable that if you're tired, you should close your eyes for 10 minutes. Your subsequent work performance will go up dramatically, rather than sitting there trying to force yourself to keep your eyes open out of some misplaced sense that you shouldn't have a nap. And if you want to do it most efficiently, there's some great data from, I think, the Transport Research Laboratory in the UK, showing that what you really need to do is have what's called a coffee nap. So it takes caffeine about 20 minutes to peak in your bloodstream. So have a good strong espresso, turn the light out in your office or wherever it happens to be, close your eyes for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. You'll get a very refreshing sleep and you'll be back to full performance.
And when you wake up, the caffeine will have kicked in.
Absolutely. So the caffeine will wake you up after 15 minutes. So it's a really good way of preventing you from having, a very long period of sleep, but it gives you a good refreshing boost.
The caveat with that presumably is that it is a standard U curve that across people about how much sleep they need, and most of us need 8 hours or so. There are some people who can get by on 4 or 5, but
they're very unusual. They're only about 1 to 2% of the population at large. There really aren't many of them around. This is a very asymmetric curve. When you look at people across the population at large, the vast majority, 98% of us, need somewhere around 7 to 8 hours.
Right. But then presumably there's a number of people also on the other side of the curve who are needing 10 or 11 hours sleep.
Oh, there are some people who do.
I frequently feel as if that should be me, but
yeah, I had that same feeling as well. But no, there are some people who are like that. Who do actually need a bit more. Again, they will be a slightly larger fraction than the 1 to 2% who only need 4
Is that
hours.
right?
Yeah, they will be something of the order of maybe, if my memory serves, about 5%.
Okay. But the natural bias that we see in the population is people tend to think, okay, the average person needs 8 hours, but I'm probably just on the shorter side of that. Whereas, in fact, the chances are that most people are probably on the longer side of that.
Possible, yeah, entirely possible. But sleep is a remarkable restorative. We know this. Your cognition is much clearer, much less cloudy when you've had a good night's sleep. You don't spend as much of the day fighting periods of sleepiness. Your memory for the things that have happened to you improves dramatically. And the best way of thinking about chronic sleep deprivation is that it's something similar to a mild state of concussion. It does cause a dramatic dip in performance. and sleep debt has to be repaid. There's just no two ways about it. It's one of those things that you can't do anything about.
And do you encourage people to sleep in your work environment? I mean, is it something that you actively promote?
I do it myself. If I'm exhausted after a meeting or a series of meetings and teaching in the morning or whatever, I'll have a strong cup of coffee. I'll turn the lights out and I'll take 15 minutes, and then I'll feel much better for the afternoon. I think it's perfectly reasonable.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, people shouldn't be coming into work to sleep. You have a duty of care to come in as refreshed as you can, and all of those kinds of things. But I think having a 10 or 15 minute nap during the course of the day is perfectly reasonable. And the world would be a better place if people did this.
If it was more accepted.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're running a bit short of time, but that's maybe the advice you'd give to your 25-year-old self, but I'll give you the opportunity to come up with something else too. But
I'll tell you the advice I give my 25-year-old self. It's very simple. It's to borrow as much money as I possibly can and buy as much of London as I possibly could. And then I would say to my somewhat older self, sell it all now.
Sell it all now. Well, yeah, we all wish we'd done that, of course. Excellent. Shane, it's been, as ever, highly entertaining and very instructive speaking to you. Thank you very much indeed. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Roddy. That was great.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Shane O'Mara. Neuroscience has opened up our understanding of our own behaviour, and each year we gain a greater understanding of why we act as we do, and importantly, why we react to others as we do. I always really enjoy conversations with scientists, and none more so than with Shane, who makes the enormous complexity of the brain become comprehensible to the rest of us, without losing the nuances. I really like the fact that Shane highlights Charles Darwin, that he was not necessarily the biggest scientific brain of his time, but that his self-doubt and constant critiquing of his own theories meant that he ironed out many of the wrinkles in his theories through constant re-evaluation. It is a key lesson for all of us that we should always be open to refining our approaches and understanding of how we work and what best practice should be. Finally, it was gratifying to hear that Shane thinks the human brain remains a long way ahead of computers in the breadth of expertise human can have against the very specialized focus of computers, and the super efficiency of our brains compared to the power-hungry supercomputers we sometimes fear. Having listened to Shane, you now have some more knowledge, but knowledge is not power, it's only potential power, and it's all about execution, taking some action towards your goal. So I urge you to start applying some of these concepts straight away. Shane has just started to write his new book that will be part of the Neuroscience for Business series from Palgrave Publishers, of which I'm series editor. The first book in the series, Neuroscience for Leadership, Harnessing the Brain Gain Advantage, won the UK's Chartered Management Institute Award for Practical Managers last year. So I'm very hopeful that Shane's book will follow in those footsteps. More quickly though, like many of our listeners, you can use the transcript of this show to remind yourself of many of Shane's points. So go ahead and download the transcript on www.innovationecosystem.com/14, and you can review the conversation, highlight sections of interest, scribble in the margins, and share it with your team and colleagues. And if you prefer pictures, you can look at the visuals we made for this episode and for the preceding 13 shows in this series. Next week, Mark talks to David Allen, the productivity consultant best known for his 2001 book, Getting Things Done, one of the most influential business books of this century. Much of his work is explained by the recent advances in neuroscience that Shane works on. The Getting Things Done, or GTD approach, is now shorthand for best practice and personal productivity. You cannot help but learn from this conversation. If you enjoy these shows, we'd be really appreciative if you can take a couple of moments to rate and review them on iTunes if you haven't done so already. These shows do take a good bit of time and effort to put together, and we love to get your feedback that way. Many thanks to all our listeners who have left reviews. We do really appreciate them. Please keep them coming. And do contact us if you have any questions for our guests or other comments. I look forward to being with you again shortly.